This is Anya Leonard, founder of Classical Wisdom. You are listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. Today's episode is with Dr. David Lewis, lecturer of Greek history and culture at the University of Edinburgh. We discuss slavery in the ancient Greek world, how it worked, who was enslaved, and a little bit about their lives. But before we get started, a quick reminder that this podcast is made possible by Classical Wisdom members. To find out more about our Classical Wisdom Society, please go to classicalwisdom.com and click Start Here.
Thank you so much, David, for joining me today.
Thank you.
So we are going to be talking about ancient bondage, slavery, that is. And would you please start us off by just a little bit of an explanation or description of what slavery looked like in the ancient Greek world?
Sure. So you're dealing with basically a property relationship. So one person owning another person, and we find this as early as the Bronze Age. We find it in Homer. We find it in right throughout the classical sources and all the way through the end of antiquity. And unsurprisingly, given the variety of the Greek world in terms of regions, you find a lot of different types there. So the most common type you probably get variations of in most places involves the slaves being imported from the periphery of the Greek world. So in the case of Athens is the classic example. They're getting their slaves mainly from two places principally. One's Thrace, so that's modern Bulgaria and parts of northern Greece. And the other one is Asia Minor, especially Central Asia Minor, which is called Phrygia in antiquity. But they also get slaves from all sorts of parts of the Black Sea, even from sub-Saharan Africa, a small number. From Syria, quite a large number. And we know about this from all sorts of sources, especially inscriptions. We have some inscriptions from Athens. We've got a great source in Delphi. We have a series of over 1,000 manumission inscriptions, so inscriptions of slaves being freed. And these start around 200 BC and go on through into the 1st century AD. And in a quite a large number of cases of those, they tell us where the slave in question came from, their ethnicity. So you can see these slaves being traded through general commercial networks to these city-states all over the place. And then you get some oddballs like Sparta. And you no doubt heard of the Spartans' helots. And I should probably own up to having a slightly unconventional interpretation of these. But in my favor, it aligns with what the sources say. So these are slaves. The problem with interpreting the status of the helots is really falls in line with the problem of interpreting what's going on in Sparta generally in the classical period, in that we've got sources that disagree with each other, that come from different dates. And if you follow the contemporary sources, you get a picture of a slave system. If you pin your faith on the sources from hundreds and hundreds of years later, it looks a little bit different. So I think the safe option is to go for the contemporary sources. So in that case, you've got a very different slave system though, because it's not topped up from the slave trade. So you're talking about Greeks, a enslaved Greek population, reproducing itself over the generations and living in families. And it's a little bit like the American, the US slave system before the Civil War. The slave trade had been cut off there in 1808, and when the Civil War started, pretty much the entire population had been of slaves had been reproducing itself through slaves living in families, having kids, and actually it grew over time. So Sparta is a little bit of an oddball. There were some other ones like that in the Greek world too. Thessaly in northern Greece had a similar system. Crete, and we know of some colonial sites like Heraclea on the Black Sea coast that also had a kind of monoglot slave population that seemed to have reproduced itself over time. So there's a lot of variety. matching the variety in the regions of the Greek world in terms of resources, geography, culture, and economic practices.
So how do you feel that the Helots were enslaved today? Because there's so many different historians who said they were, one conquered group that didn't pay tribute, and there's many different versions. Do you have one that you prefer?
No, because the problem with the origin of the Helots is the sources we have are from hundreds and hundreds of years after the events they purport to describe. Basically, it looked like this. In the classical period, there was, in places like Sparta, there was a slave population that reproduced itself, wasn't topped up from the outside, spoke this exactly the same dialect of Greek as his masters. People like Plato and Aristotle come along, Theopompus of Chios, and Ephorus and other historians, and they go, how did this come about? And the obvious explanation is that the Helots were enslaved in one fell swoop way back in the olden days. These rationalizations get mixed in with other rationalizations like the Dorian invasion and these kind of things. Some of them are just completely see-through. So, for example, there's a town at in Laconia, south of Sparta, called Helos. It means swamp town. And in antiquity, there was a kind of etymological explanation that, the Helots got their name because they were from Helos and they were all enslaved, and well, there you go. Except the etymology doesn't work at all in Greek. The pronunciation of Helot in Greek is very different. So these are really kind of late rationalizations trying to make sense of facts on the ground, and they're not worth putting too much faith in. Now we can ask where these populations came from, but it's probably not worth being overly sanguine about getting an answer that will be uncontested and finish the debate.
Now, in most of the rest of ancient Greece, you could sort of enslave anybody without any problem, but you weren't supposed to enslave another Greek. So how did the ancient Athenians feel about the Spartans enslaving Greeks?
Well, the problem isn't enslaving other Greeks, and the Greeks did this all the time in warfare, enslaving other Greeks. And in somewhere like the Athenians, at least after the time of Solon, so it's the beginning of the 6th century, weren't supposed to enslave free people in Attica, so that wasn't cool. But once you're abroad, it's a different matter. And if there's a war, and actually, if you look at the Delphic manumissions, you can see quite a lot of Greeks in there too. So there's as many Greeks in there as there are Thracians, for example. The predominance overall is for foreigners, but there's a fairly significant proportion of Greeks. So war, piracy, these kinds of processes end up with Greeks being enslaved by other Greeks, and it's kind of a case of hard luck then, from the Greek point of view.
And because the slaves came from so many different places, I guess you just didn't have the same issues with sort of identifying slaves, obviously. I mean, was it clear when somebody was a slave by their skin color or religion or things like that, or did people kind of have a feeling for it?
So there's certain traits that were seen as stereotypical of slaves, like having, facial tattoos or something like that. Having red hair. This is something Thracians were supposed to have red hair, blonde hair, people from the north. But really, you can't tell legal status at sight that easily, because that same person could be manumitted. They could be freed, and they look exactly the same, but they've got a completely different legal status. And we've got this kind of rant by a guy that's known as the old oligarch. He's probably not that old, actually, but he's kind of a right-wing guy. He's very pro-Spartan. He thinks Athens should be run like Sparta, and wouldn't it be better if the Athenian slave system was run like the Spartan system of helotage? And he complains about people not being able to tell the difference in Athens between slaves and free persons. Whereas in Sparta, actually, you can spot a citizen a mile off because they've got very particular habits of dress, and they have a beard but with no mustache, and they have long hair that they're allowed to grow after they come of age. They seem to have particular items of clothing that allow you to pick these guys out in a crowd. So in terms of dress and appearance in Sparta, kind of encoded legal status in a way that didn't happen in many other places. So it really depends where you are.
Do we know much about the life of the slaves? And I mean, I guess there's certain individuals or what their day-to-day life was like. Do we have much insights into that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So, and this is a question that people are asking a lot in research at the moment, trying to get a handle on the agency of slaves and that kind of thing. I mean, we know about the lives of certain very prominent ones. So from the orators, the Athenian orators, we've got good examples of, well, there's a lady, Neaira, Demosthenes 59, and that speech at least purports to give us the outline of this woman's life. As she starts off as a child slave in the Peloponnese and then is groomed up by a madam called Nicorete, I think, to work as a hetaira, a courtesan, a prostitute. And we get a lot of details about her life, and you can ask questions about how much of that is true. And then we've got a pretty good amount of information on another quite prominent slave, Passion, who was a banker in Athens and did very well for himself and was manumitted, became the richest guy in town, became an Athenian citizen. So you get these occasional cases of exceptional people, but what about all the other slaves?
Yeah.
And it's true. Most of our evidence is very unrepresentative of them, but sometimes you get the odd bits and pieces that gives you an insight into them. So there was a really interesting document found in the I think it's from the Athenian Agora and possibly the Kerameikos, but it's a letter written on a strip of lead from the 4th century, and it's from a slave called Lysis, and it's to his mother and this guy called Xenocles. We don't know who Xenocles was, but it's asking them to intercede with his owners. So he's co-owned by at least 2 masters, maybe more. And what these masters have done, they put this slave in a foundry, like a blacksmith shop, and he's getting knocked about very badly. And the letter's basically trying to get his mother and the Xenocles guy to talk his masters into taking him out of this foundry and putting him into some other line of work that he won't get as badly abused at. So you occasionally get documents like that. Another genre that's being very interesting in recent years are these oracular lamellae from Dodona in northwestern Greece. Some questions to the god there at the shrine. And we've got one at least from a slave called Kitos, and he's asking the god whether his master will basically hold up his side of the bargain and free him like he promised he would. So very occasionally you get these bits of evidence that give you a direct kind of connection to the voice of slaves, but those are the exception rather than the rule.
Classical Wisdom members can listen to the whole podcast on classicalwisdom.com. Thank you for listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks.